Welcome to the last session of the day. This is the moment where we get to cover aspects of the job guarantee in our work that we didn't get a chance to touch on, and really I'm hoping that we can make this a bigger discussion. So we're going to take a few minutes to just have some individual remarks. Rohan, then Darrick, if you'd like to go next. Rania, I will conclude and then open for discussion. So take it away.
I think I have to use both, right? Sam, I have to use this as well? Yeah, okay, cool. Hi everyone again. The topic for today on the job guarantee, that the prompt was sort of who runs it, who pays for it, who's eligible to participate, pay and benefits, types of work, how to ensure inclusivity, what are the benefits to individuals and communities, how to push it through Congress, what are the political barriers. And as I started thinking of this, I thought, I got a lot of thoughts. I don't have any answers. I haven't won yet. But I have a lot of thoughts, and I think I've got a lot of better thoughts than I had before, but it's not because I've got, just magically more intelligent. It's because I learned them from better people. So I think I'm going to try and introduce you to all the people and the places I learned these different parts of how I'm trying to approach this from. My journey to my friends and what I'm doing right now. It's a bit psychoanalytical, tell me about your parents and how it's their relationship thing. So apologies if it sounds egocentric. You're welcome to accuse me of that to my face afterwards if it makes you feel better for me forcing you to sit through it. So there'll be two phases of the story. First is about myself, and then is about my collaboration. My dad is a lawyer. I knew I wanted to be a lawyer when I was a young kid. It was power. I could see it in his work. He was a federal government employee, a Labour Party hack, a federal legislator. He had individual clients. It was like Seinfeld used to say about lawyers. Everyone else is just moving their pieces around the board, but if something goes wrong, the lawyers have read all the rules on the inside of the box. And I was like, yeah, that sounds like a good one to do. And I knew I wanted to make a difference sort of internationally. Australia is great, but it's a bit of a backwater. The United States is the hegemon, and if you live under the Roman Empire and you want to make some justice eventually, you have to go to Rome. So I did international studies and went to the United States on exchange. I studied political science at Penn with the Wharton Business School. I did debating because I'd seen the most powerful people in Australia do debating internationally, and I'd seen how they build their little networks of elites. And I met a bunch of bankers and realized you needed to take money seriously because they didn't take you seriously if you didn't take money seriously, both as an ally and more importantly as an enemy. I started reading a lot of blogs and newspapers and got very bored on exchange. And then I met MMT and came to MMT through the global financial crisis, trying to understand what the hell was going on. Started by understanding the endogenous money. Wow, banks do something entirely different to what I'd thought. Got from that through into the charterless component and then the job guarantee. And the job guarantee made intuitive sense to me because I'm under the age of 40 and I'm not blind and the world is burning. And if you want to do something about that, you're going to need to have a vision for robust public investment in climate. And that means you need to have a vision for defeating austerity, and nothing else seemed to be working in 2009, 2010. Also was interested in international politics, and it seems like people fight a lot more when there's not much stuff. So trying to get beyond those kinds of conflicts also seemed to make sense from an international relations perspective. But I wasn't, resistant to the job guarantee in any way. A lot of people who get into this through the money like to think they can somehow cordon off or separate the job guarantee as a part of the vision. And like John and Chris said yesterday, part of the MMT project to me is connecting money and labor back together again. So there was a human rights dimension. I found Phil Harvey at Rutgers Law School, and he's talking about the tradition of FDR and human rights, which obviously MMT had pointed to, but he was really living in that tradition, working with the same kind of activist networks and things, and considering them his clients in the way that I was starting to think of the MMT community as my client. And he took a mentorship role. I read his stuff. It was interesting to see what a lawyer looked at the job guarantee rather than the MMT kind of macroeconomic stabilization approach. And the things that he would emphasize, more granular detail, thinking about the union politics of taking this seriously, getting into the enforcement and accountability mechanisms in more detail. And I could see that he had things to add. I had learned a huge amount about the job guarantee from MMT, but I could see that having my legal eyes on that he was adding something that was very important as well. But I thought he was wrong on the MMT. I thought he was wrong on the macro to the extent he wasn't here doing this because he thought he knew something more about macro than the MMT, as I think he was wrong on it. And the way to sort of synthesize his ideas about taking multi-tiered labor wages and things in could be synthesized with a buffer stock logic, as Fardel's doctoral dissertation, I think, showed quite well, but that Phil had not really tried to meet them halfway, and to an extent, I don't think that they had tried to meet him as much of the way either. But I could see that there was a pathway through MMT in this New Deal tradition. And that brought in a third tradition, which was the sort of gendered social reproduction vision. As I started to try to get granular, one of the people whose work really inspired me was Pavlina, looking at the social entrepreneurship model, trying to connect this federal public power down to a grassroots organic growth process of the kind that Rania's model earlier today was getting into even more granular detail about. And others like Zvadka Todorova talking about how to take feminist ideas and apply them to the study of macro itself. I could see growth there. We need to hire everybody, but also do so in ways that build social systems of reproduction that are explicitly gender conscious and gender just. I was never particularly interested in the workforce, but I am interested in reproducing communities. My mother, I'm a musician by identity. My mother and my aunt were both music teachers. My mother runs a music studio at home from 0 years old with babies classes through to adults, many of whom become music teachers. My aunt ran the music department of both the elementary and the high school I went to, and took us on international tours and performed in really high-level venues with leading musicians. So I got to see an entire industry right from the very top to the very bottom. And they helped each other and worked with each other. They had a Saturday school together that I also went through from the age of 0. And the Saturday students came to the schools, they came music teachers, they taught at the schools. It was a whole kind of ecosystem, and they took responsibility for the whole thing. So I had grown up thinking about that, designing music classes, getting into education theory. I went to the United States and worked a bit for Americans for the Arts, trying to work out how they could lean into the 2008 crisis and the federal stimulus package and get some money for artists and arts organizations. I started working a little bit later at law school with volunteer lawyers for the arts and started working with them there. But I also was mostly interested in education. I thought I'd go to law school to do education policy. So in between, I decided to go get a master's degree in music education. And I started doing education policy, federal and international, looking at school design and things like that. Got the opportunity to come back, work with Americans for the Arts on their big vision for leveraging the kind of remake of the economy. Made sure I put in a job guarantee for artists, made sure I put in complementary currencies as a way to encourage local artistic community development. I did some volunteer teaching when I was doing music ed and music performance in New York. I was teaching at a charter school in Harlem that I was assigned there. I had thoughts about the charter school movement, as I'm sure anyone who's paying attention to the charter school movement will. But I thought it was a good place to get some experience, see a different educational opportunity, and the school was Harlem Children's Zone, which was run by a man named Jeffrey Canada. You may remember him from the Waiting for Superman movie. He was Barack Obama's favorite kind of charter school champion, and he had this vision that sounded very seductive of wraparound school services. We're going to take over whole city blocks. We're going to go from zero to the grave. We're going to have parental classes before the kids are even born on nutrition and care. And we're going to make sure when they graduate, they go into good colleges and we follow them through. And then maybe they'll come back and lead our communities. Oh, by the way, the whole thing's funded by Goldman Sachs. And they want to have accountability because they're not just going to give black people some money. Come on, are you joking? We want to control the conditions here. So what's that? High stakes testing. What do we actually need? Literacy and math. I worked at the school in the music department. It was the only thing that brought half of those kids in because those classes were so damn miserable. They were smiling and our classes are miserable there. There are other problems with that school and things, but the actual curriculum was terrible, and you start to think about curricular reform. What do they need to learn? And I was studying classes on education theory and politics, and what we think people should learn to reproduce our society is inherently political question. Often it's obedience, often it's fascist propagandistic symbols and hand over your chest stuff, but sometimes it's also literacy and skills and the arts and all that kind of thing. But then you get to higher ed and you go, well, wait a second, we're producing degrees getting into what jobs? We're producing people and sending them off the cliff like a lemmings game. And there's nothing on the other side because we don't have a theory of jobs. So maybe that wraparound thing wasn't too bad, but the financing and the accountability structure and the actual industry on the other side is still there. And then I, at the time, was living in Harlem in New York City, and it became clear just how fundamental racial inequality and white supremacy was to everything. Absolutely everything. in that space, and that you can't do anything good there unless it's done in an intentionally race-conscious and race-just way. And luckily I had a bridge. It was Matthew Forstater. Matthew Forstater had been writing about the civil rights movement connection to MMT from the beginning. And he had also been writing about the ecological connections, and it was very important to see him connecting all of those things together. And then, of course, I found Darrick, and I found Sandy, and I went, there's an entire tradition, not a macroeconomic tradition in the sense of, Nairu and that kind of theory, but an actual black radical political economy tradition that, of course, has come to the conclusion this is a central thing for justice, because it is. And I go, okay, wow, there's more people in my pantheon that I have to be taking into account. There's more voices in this choir that we have to make sure are being heard properly. MMT is about good systems design, ending austerity. FDR is about individual rights, yeah. But the civil rights movement is about social justice, and without that, you don't have any of the others at all worth doing. And I get to law school. My second law school paper is on a job guarantee. I invite MMTers in to steal a bit of valor from the Ivy League law school system. We put on some good events. I basically make my own education around MMT and law. And I did my master's thesis on MMT, job guarantee for the arts and culture, and its implications for copyright debates. Because when you're trying to help everybody learn, then the fact that everybody puts all the information and knowledge and culture behind a paywall on the basis of a pretty crummy theory of economic incentives seems like an important barrier to knock down. I also worked with the New York City Department of Education and a criminal justice reentry education network. And that got me into understanding that education is also a prison issue. I went to Louisiana and worked with the Sentencing Commission down there, where they incarcerate more people than anywhere in the United States and more than the Russian gulags at their peak. And started to ask the question, what do you do when you deal with a state that puts that many people in jail on clearly white supremacist lines? Because it's not just prison, it's still modern living slavery. They're on the literal plantation. What do you do if you want to try to stop that? Because the entire state's economy is built around private prisons. And you can't replace something with nothing. The iron law of capitalism is it will not be replaced unless there's something better. And it's not going to be the Republican governor of Louisiana that's going to do that anytime soon, is it? So the job guarantee made sense in that way. And this was also a thing I knew internationally with war, right? The dark side of austerity internationally is fascism. The dark side of the full employment response is fascism. And my old law professor, Eben Moglen, said when they come for my family next time, they'll get every single one because of all of this tech stuff that Raoul will be telling you about on Friday, all the surveillance stuff. And they're coming, right? We can see it. We can see the fascist rise again. We can see it as an attenuated response to that macroeconomic break, just like 29 has roots going into 39. And so I start to look at what it means to actually try to do that civil rights thing, try to look at that rainbow coalition. And it means looking at, not only Sandy and Darrick, Alan Aha and the Latino connection there, the Latinx connection, Daniel Bastillo and social work reproduction, Tracy McMillan Cottom looking at higher education, and historians tracing out different intellectual traditions that now I have to be responsible to, as well as responsible to the MMT tradition. So that's people like Nina Banks tracing the history of Sadie Alexander as the first African-American woman attorney who spent her life advocating for a job guarantee. Or Paulie Murray, whose ideas inspired Brown v. Board of Education and Thurgood Marshall, who spent her life advocating against Jane Crow, one of the earliest intersectional feminist articulations in the American legal scene, and then also argued for full employment. So I need to be honoring and respectful of those traditions as well as that MMT thing. Right? Making sure that as I'm synthesizing these things, that both sides are learning from each other and nothing going away. So that brings me to the collaboration. I was very grateful to be embraced by the MNT community as a law student. They're so welcoming, always giving me time, always saying yes to events. Only one person, very, very distantly affiliated with the entire community, ever asked for an honorarium, and I won't name names, but everybody else, including 100% of the people here, did not, and never have, which is not a reflection of whether they deserve them, but a reflection of their respect for students and supporting the education led by the young. I was invited to join the board of the National Jobs for All Network, which is the sort of last institutional legacy of the civil rights full employment coalition that had been led by Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King, and carried on by Coretta Scott King after Martin's death through to the late 70s, resulting in the Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act. Balanced growth, balanced budget. And while I was at law school, I met Raul Carrillo, whose commitments to the job guarantee are far more personally deeply rooted in the commitment to racial and indigenous and anti-imperial justice in the United States than mine. We became fused at the hip professionally, and we formed a non-profit called the Modern Money Network that was envisaged to be a student learning organization interested in the intersection of money and law. And we started to try and craft a pathway that was synthetic, that brought those different traditions together. And we started to try and add value to those communities and work out the problems that we could help solve. 2018, a group called Policy Link, headed by Angela Blackwell and one of her staffers, Sarah Trehaft, started to organize a vision for a racial justice-oriented job guarantee coalition, and invited everybody together from different backgrounds, including the MMT Coalition. And I thought, this is probably the first time something is coming together that looks like the scale of the coalition from the 60s and 70s when we were last even close. And then there's another person that we met whose name is Scott Ferguson, who's a film and media studies professor and a former film star, child film star. He had been coming to MMT on his own terms. We met him through all the various blogs and Facebook groups and things. And he's a decade older than me, and as we started building this learning organization, and I wanted it to be interdisciplinary, right? We'd already done law and econ, and I'll tell you what, if I can handle that boring shit, I'll certainly bring some artists and humanities people in. So of course, let's create a separate division for you and start to coordinate. And your work is, not going to be focused on policy directly necessarily in the same way or on legal granular details, but looking at the broader cultural and social implications. Right, we need bread and roses, and they're doing a lot of work on the roses side of things. This art was commissioned by Scott, a man named Mark Montgomery, and it sort of embodied some of the values that we wanted our job guarantee work to aim towards. We began organizing a teach-in in 2018, but pretty much immediately after that, there was AOC. There was the Green New Deal. The Sunrise Movement had already started reading about our work. They were young people. They liked learning about economics. They found some of our stuff and MMT through that. They asked to co-sponsor the MMT conference in 2018 before anybody knew who they were. And we knew who they were, and they knew who we were. Andres Bernal, who was at the New School and helped organize that MMT conference, connected MMTers with Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, and she switched her policy messaging from a basic income to a job guarantee on that basis, and then mentioned MMT at a point when the financial journalism world needed some big names to attach to it to tell their story of its rise, which was already happening, but got a huge boost of electricity from her connection. So we started finding ourselves pretty close to the Bernie energy through Stephanie, of course, and through this younger squad energy through our own connections, a generational division of labor around that front. We tried to bring in our other great colleagues so they could meet the economists who we thought were the economists of our generation. And we started meeting with the other squad members. Raul had started working on financial privacy. He connected with Presley's office, Ayanna Presley's office from Boston, and I went down at their suggestion to meet one of their staffers, Aya Ibrahim, who is now in the White House working on crypto regulation. And we talked about bank accounts for all, and then privacy, which got us onto racial justice, which from there led us to the fact that Presley was on the House Financial Services Committee and for an upcoming hearing on the Humphrey Hawkins bill, wanted to know if we had any questions that she might ask to Powell. And I said, well, maybe you could ask about the black women tradition of job guarantee advocacy. And so she did. And we worked on some questions with some leading civil rights movement historians, and she got a great response to it. It made the news. It made Powell look flat-footed and ignorant about an important tradition of his own institution. And they got emboldened and said, let's start working on a job guarantee proposal. Talk about the dog that caught the car, right? The leading African-American member of the squad says, write me the job guarantee bill that does the thing we were trying to do in the 70s. And that's when I realized that the legislative first strategy doesn't work because you don't have the coalition behind you, and the coalition actually is telling you what the important questions and answers are. So of course we split it into two. We started, let's just do a little baby step first. We'll do this resolution, and then we'll do a full bill. Well, the resolution's out, the bill's still coming because those details are where the devil lies. So we built in buffer stock logic, we built in MMT financing, we built in concerns for unions and individual rights enforcement, we built in gender, racial equity, we built in environmental sustainability considerations and disability access, and we tried to make it the kind of job guarantee we'd be proud to defend. And we started to try and build a coalition. We brought in our colleagues and tried to get their input, who are also doing a million other things and trying to find the line between those things and ours. We brought in other organizations who might be supportive but don't really know where it fits within their priorities, many of which are already being baked in. And that group Policy Link, who initially brought us together, was leading the charge. The only one who devoted real resources to it, because we had none yet. And they were the ones who were consistently organizing and keeping the coalition together. We worked on joint language, we developed FAQs, we worked with other job guarantee advocates in other countries, we set up a website with explainers, spoke to media people. The resolution rollout went great, and then we started to think about exactly how many experts we would need for this bill, how many different stakeholders we would need to bring in, how the hell you even do that, what that looks like, how many hours a week are we having the same meeting with 56 groups before we split them into one, and then start the next meeting and do the same thing on a different issue. And then 3 things happened. COVID turned everyone's attention to emergency cash relief, not jobs, despite Pavlina shouting to the wilderness that they shouldn't, and she's obviously vindicated now. And then Biden got elected and everyone gave up on the job guarantee because his team said in no uncertain terms they won't consider it. And then now gas prices and energy prices and everything else is going up, and no one wants to talk about consuming less gas because they want it for cheaper, not more expensive. And so the Green New Deal is essentially on hold. So back to where I got started with all of this was the climate change. I'm still feeling a bit damn lost, but there's a few quick lessons and then I'll end. First is that we can't divorce different struggles for justice. They have to be together, and in fact will only be together. Will only win if they're together. We have to think about social reproduction as the framework for institution building, both internally within our community and within the job guarantee connecting to the industries that we care about. Arts, education, even down to the family model itself. We can't stay outside of current events, no matter how much we build on our own terms. Tsunamis happen, as well as tectonic plate shifts, and we need to be involved in predicting and responding in rapid time, even if that means a 90-degree angle turn in our collective priorities. We need so much more power. David Stein, one of the historians of the civil rights movement, talks about just how big that coalition was. Gender justice, racial justice, economic justice, much stronger union movement, student movement, and it was not enough. It wasn't enough. It got crushed. It got crushed in part because of macroeconomic mistakes that the MMTers are trying to make sure we can not make again. But it got crushed for other reasons too, and we haven't really seriously grappled with all of them. And we need to get granular with the details, because the details are just really ultimately representations of problems we've avoided taking responsibility for yet. So we need to address those problems. Most importantly, we need to address them now. That's the only thing I'm adding. If there's one thing I can add to the entire set of questions from the start, it's just the word now. Because all the things that I just said are the things that keep me up at night every day that I haven't worked out how to answer, and if we don't answer them, we won't get there. And if nobody starts thinking about them, it'll just be me and we'll keep failing, because I'm already failing. And if we are going to get a job guarantee that does some of the bad things, right, keeps the white supremacy, keeps the social exclusion, doesn't deal with climate change, we need to identify that as an enemy. The enemy is in the rearview mirror, it's around us, but the enemy is also in the future. There is a dystopic version of winning partially, and we need to be clear about what that looks like. Now. Thanks.
Thank you, Rohan, so very much. And I just want to say that I think you've already heard about his work, and you can appreciate the kind of enormous contribution that Rohan Raoul and the legal department have made. But I just want to share from our perspective, from those of us who were writing on MMTA in the early years, and we had. We our very first collaborations were, with Sandy and with Darrick, and we found friends among Phil Harvey and others, but we were still talking among ourselves. And of course, when the media took on the MMT message, that gave us a lot of visibility. Of course, the crisis opened up spaces for us to send our message. But at least in my opinion, like the true renaissance that came after the first phase of scholarship was our connections to the legal department, to the historians, to the humanities and all the other folks who join us, because I think that that was a personal message that I learned. That is something that you just echoed, that we are in this together. And in fact, once we understand how these other ideas impact our own work, we become that more effective, that more powerful. So I just want to say thank you. And I want to hand it off to Darrick, who put together a really aspirational vision. I think this is where our conversation needs to go, with first premises of what we're doing on the basis of economic rights, just grounding our work on this kind of basic humanity, and what are the preconditions for us making good on those promises. I want to give you a chance maybe to talk a little bit more about sort of the practical details. What are the steps to move forward to achieve that vision of inclusivity? Maybe if you want to spend some time to talk about, strategic, moves that we can make in terms of legislation or design features. How do we make sure that we provide for the basic floor? All those questions that Rohan enumerated. Inclusivity, types of work, pay benefits, all that.
So I'm going to be a bad guest and bulk a little on the question and say the details. We do have a paper where you can look at the plans. I'll highlight some of them. In terms of the politics of it, well, momentum builds, and don't let pessimism get in the way. There are people that are championing these start local. If we can't go directly to the federal government, there are pockets in the country that are more committed and willing to pilot or demonstrate aspects of a job guarantee, and we could talk about specificity of how that could look. I know there's somebody in the audience, I forgot his name, it's terrible, who is living in Cleveland right now. And Cleveland, I'm not completely familiar with it, but that area of University Heights, I believe, that some of the services that were outsourced, they decided to facilitate hospital and university communities with jobs directly in that area, and they were intentional in providing and building jobs rather than outsourcing certain things. So there can be approaches to be done at local levels where we don't have to wait on the federal government. What else could we be strategic about? Building coalitions. I think Rohan, as well as Pavlina, laid out some key partnerships that are not just happening, but intentional. So I think work on common narratives, work on cooperation. There are aspects in which we differ, and you'll probably hear some through this panel today, but the values themselves, I don't think we differ on. And that's okay to fight on some of the points of getting to the values, but you want to be in coordination and conversation with those that share similar values. Let me also shout out, Rohan did a great job of naming a lot of people that have been involved in this movement, but Helen Ginsberg also, I think she's worth singling out. She passed away perhaps a year or two ago. I'm in pandemic years, so I forget timing, but she was a professor at Brooklyn College. She was a New School grad, and she was a strong champion from the days of civil rights until her passing with the federal job guarantee. I'll say a couple other things. Maybe I'll hit some of the questions, or would you? Okay. So some of the prompts we had were, who runs it? And you want some local facilitation on the ability to define and determine what's relevant to those communities, because at a granular level, we might not know. We might not know about a creek in a particular rural town for which some labor could be used to transform a community to facilitate transportation. I don't know. So you want to have that capacity to input. But here's something that in the United States we need to recognize, in my view, is that history of Jim Crow where we allowed for too much local control. So I think we require some federal oversight, even with local implementation, for a few reasons. One, the federal government, at the end of the day, has the capacity to make it sustainable. And the federal government, perhaps, if done right, can have the just infrastructure to avoid some of the tyranny that can occur in localities. The second prompt, and I'm going to be quick because I know I talked a lot already, was who pays for it? And you all are here with a lot of MMT scholars and originators. Let me say that pay-go is a problem. Pay-go is selectively used, and it's often selectively used to thwart a progressive movement. It is a political mechanism, a tactic. So if we're thinking politically, one, in addition to abolishing the filibuster in the Senate, and perhaps the Senate altogether, one should definitely put a bullseye on pay-go as something that limits our capacity to have nice things. What else do I want to say? Obviously the program would have attributes that would reduce some of our subsistence anti-poverty programs not aimed at trying to have people have mobility or have people have agency, but rather to treat them as surplus populations. So that's a good thing. That would be some cost savings. And then the other point about how we would pay for, well, it's an investment. It's an investment in America's greatest resource. And perhaps I sound a lot of pie in the sky, but I actually believe this and believe that we have history to support it. Our most treasured resource and investment has always been people, has always been facilitating people to be their best selves. I think the New Deal demonstrates that, but I'm confident we can find other examples in the globe where that generates not only a direct impact on people's lives where you've improved their lives directly, but the spillover multiplier effects are better and more efficient and more powerful and righteous. Who's eligible to participate? Well, it's a right. It's a human right. So everybody, by definition, would be eligible to participate. But we also know that historically, implementation of human rights have not always been inclusive. So the language, my colleagues and I at the institute that I direct have been using is inclusive economic rights intentionally. Some people may say, well, why do you need inclusive? It's an economic rights, an economic rights. But we know historically that we design policies, we implement policies, and we manage them in ways that are exclusive. And we can cite the examples. So you want to be intentionally anti-racist. You want to be intentionally anti-sexist. You want to make sure that the design, the management of it, and the implementation is intentionally inclusive. The other question was pay and benefits. What would be some of the pay and the benefits? Well, you wanted above poverty wages, right? Obviously, it's self-defeating if you just have poverty wages. You want it to be above poverty wages. And it essentially sets a floor on the economy. And it says, so we have a society that politically uses markets to discipline poor people and discipline workers. Turn that on its head. Discipline bad employers. Put a floor, doesn't get rid of, your ideology might be capitalism or socialism, which I think are largely academic concepts to begin with. In practice, we never fully implement either one of those concepts. But regardless of your ideology, basically what a federal job guarantee is saying, if you want to hire American workers, you have to offer them at least this. You have to offer them at least this wage, at least these working conditions, at least these benefits. So it becomes a de facto public option for a variety of things, from not only a minimum wage, which, by the way, the true minimum wage, here's where I'm conservative, is always zero. So the minimum wage programs are useful, vital, I support them, but at the end of the day, they don't go far enough because the true minimum wage will always be zero. Well, a federal job guarantee puts a floor on the labor market, and it disciplines employers by saying you will not exploit or extract in a way that goes below at least this level. So it empowers people. Again, I got to be quick because I know I talk a lot. Types of work, physical and human infrastructure. Right now the rhetoric around neoliberalism is industrial policy is bad and we don't have an industrial policy. Well, guess what? That's an industrial policy. the choice not to have an and first off, we do have an industrial policy, but that's, again, a normative thing. But we should be intentional in planning and where we should be investing to facilitate our public and physical and human infrastructure. And we should do it in a way that prosperity is social, in a way that if we're investing public dollars, we want to not invest it in a way where all the benefits remain private. And in fact, if it's done well, it should also have spillover effects to increase private benefit as well. Certainly, firms benefited from the New Deal. Certainly, firms grew a lot during the New Deal. So I'd add that. How do we ensure inclusivity? It's a right, federal oversight. What are the benefits to individuals and communities? I can talk all day on that. I'm gonna be succinct and say mental, human, and physical infrastructure rise. Obviously, the burden of being unemployed on individuals, communities, and families is dramatic. Alcoholism, drug use, the whole rhetoric around death by despair, et cetera, et cetera. Well, a job is not the only mechanism by which humans get dignity and even economic viability, but it's a big one. So it would facilitate people to have the dignity and decency of a good, productive job. It will, also wanted to cite Bernie Sanders in this one. So we thanks to Stephanie Kelton, I had the opportunity to brief him prior to 2016 about a federal job guarantee. And I thought I was smart and going to go in there and tell him, look at all the things that the New Deal built. Let me go show you all these big monuments and projects. Bernie Sanders was spot on. He said, yeah, that's great and all, but reimagine the future that you want. With a federal job guarantee, we get to choose the future and define the infrastructure that we think is valuable. It's not just science fiction. We can employ public resources in a way to design the attributes and things that we think are useful and valuable. How do we get it across Congress? Messaging, avoid co-optation. I think we might hear a lot of stuff about the right, but a lot of the problems will come from the so-called left. That when I gave my remarks, I argued that there was a consensus with regards to this neoliberal vision amongst the right and the left at this point. So avoid having the vision co-opted in a way in which it's not intended to be co-opted. Commit to the movement. And then also, it is a component of economic rights. This is another problem on the left. We get caught up in the framework of scarcity where we compete with each other over attributes that, yes, we need that too. You know, people will say, what about early childhood? Yeah, we need that. What about guaranteed income? We need that. What about health care? We need that. An economic rights vision is recognizing that there is a set of inalienable goods and services that without them, people don't have agency in their lives. So it's not a right to the disco, although people should have a right to get in to do their entertainment, but it's a right to not be hungry. It's a right to have housing and health care. And a federal job guarantee is perhaps a cornerstone, but it won't do all of it. What are the political barriers? The unchallenged purported dogma of the proverbial market, along with the political fodder in which black people are weaponized as undeserving, and the government is framed as tilting the scale in favor of these undeserving individuals. That is, to me, a political barrier, not only the federal job guarantee, but a lot of progressive policies that could transform society. And we can sum that up in the neoliberal tropes. So we need to do some narrative work. We need to do some values work where we change the values of society, and the policies that we talk about, they will be good academic conversations and discussions, but for this movement, if we don't do that work with regards to values and narratives, it won't come to fruition. Last thing I'm going to end on is three things that people often, perhaps people that are more academic, that try to be critical of the program, in my experience, have offered as critiques of it. One is there's going to be large take-up, larger than you anticipate. Second, what about regional variation? What about different cost of livings? What about different depleted areas? And then the third one is probably the one that's most prominent in the argument, which is efficiency loss. What are going to be the efficiency losses associated with a job guarantee, basically framed in market efficiency? So the first one, large take-up, good. That's the point. The point is to ensure that people have a viable alternative to exploitive and extractive work. And the large take-up will be counter-cyclical, which is also good. It has automatic stabilizing features. Regional variation, well, Pavlina has done tremendous work in this area. Well, it provides regional stabilization. Areas that are depleted for whatever reasons, and I bet they'll have political impacts as well. So when we shift from coal to better energy, more clean energy, and the potential job losses in places like West Virginia, where you have the politics of a certain demographic that might have greater political efficacy in American politics, well, you would have jobs going to those regions. You'd have resources automatically going into regions that are suffering for whatever reasons, which not only will build up those regions and promote infrastructure for new jobs, but I dare say will have political efficacy as well. Efficiency loss. So this is, again, that dogma that in ways to instill productivity, fairness, is grounded in some market sanction that is the arbiter of good and bad behavior, of worth, of ingenuity, which lacks in its concept of efficiency notions of power, notions of accrued benefits by which you begin. And then the other point I'll just end on is, again, what did I say is our most treasured investment? People themselves. So another framework of thinking about efficiency and productivity is investment. Empowering people with the necessary ingredients so that they can be their best selves. Empowering people with the necessary ingredients so that they can generate in ways that none of us might not be able to fathom. And some of the guaranteed income experiments that have been going on in our country have provided some narrative and demonstrations of what can happen when people are offered agency with just additional resources.
Thank you so much, Darrick. On this table, Rania is the only person that has put her research where her mouth is and has actually made the very, very difficult choices to run for government and to be in the crossfire and to, be a public face of a program that was innovative as a policy response that goes counter to the way we traditionally do things. So I want to give you a chance to tell us a little bit more about what you couldn't cover, but specifically if you want to address how you tackle these myths, how as a public figure, as somebody who's advocating for this program, you were able to counter the myths about the unemployed and the training as effective tool and everything else that you may wish to share.
Thank you, Pavlina. First of all, I want to really share with you my excitement and my congratulations for during the years that I've been away from 2015 until now. You guys have done miracles. I've been reading in the newspapers some of what you've been doing, but it gives me hope. And as I heard you speak, I said, here is my analyst, because I should talk to him much more often, because the experience actually that I came from called for a lot of pessimism. The programming, the details, all of that were pretty much appreciated by all involved. But nonetheless, the resistance was tremendous. As I said earlier, I don't think in terms of either or when it comes to a variety of interventions that promote our rights, economic, social. Actually, I don't like the distinction of economic and social, but anyway, that's another very big discussion. So when it comes to minimum income guarantee and the job guarantee, I don't like to see them as opposites, but rather to ask, who is it for? What are you trying to accomplish when you use minimum income and so on? Let me tell you, though, that when it comes to Europe, Greece, when I arrived in 2015, Greece and Italy were the only two countries that did not have a minimum income guarantee policy. And I was 100% sure that the IMF, in other countries, it was the IMF and the World Bank, that would use a minimum income guarantee policy as mitigation of the disaster austerity and privatization had brought to a variety of countries. In fact, they would put it in the memorandum of understanding as one of the conditionalities, that in order to get the next reimbursement of the loan, you have to have a program running. So this happened to Greece as well. And we provided the data, we provided the information, we said poverty in Greece has one single phase, unemployment. So let's do something about temporary employment that would provide A, B, C, D positive results. The resistance was tremendous. And as we went from one disbursement to the next disbursement of the funds that Greece was to receive from the IFIs, the more successful the program was, the more resistance there was. Because ultimately the fear of market interference, labor market interference, was there and could not, from an ideological point of standpoint, we could not really overcome it in our discussions. So I was thrilled to see the direction that you have been taking on this. It calls for optimism, essentially. Having seen this scenery, having lived through the scenery, I said to myself that the only way forward is not enlightened leadership. I used to think that if you are a left government, if you are super progressive, and you are in Congress, or you are in a cabinet, you can make it. No. I have changed my mind 100%, and that's why I give zero pro bono time to politicians, okay? I give all of my time to grassroots organizing in Europe, because it's going to take a long time. Let it take a long time. The solid and only basis is if there is a bottom-up demand for our rights, whatever those rights are, okay? So this is one point that I want to make. We need, no matter where we come from, we need to keep this in mind, and I'm not suggesting to anyone not to work with members of parliaments, not at all, but let us not harbor the illusion that one person or a very progressive government that gets elected can fight the good fight against all powers that exist. You cannot do that. Now, I'd like to go very quickly because I took too much time speaking earlier, and I know from the discussions that there are questions. Who runs it? I'm going to agree 100% that there has to be a federal level coordination. The political capture at the local level and the incipient clientelism with all of what I suggested earlier, ways to fence off any potential for corruption and so on and so forth. I realized early on that what municipalities would do is they would include specific projects that required specific skills so that specific people would get in. Now, when you have people that are unemployed, at some point I ask myself, what do you care? I mean, everybody's unemployed out there. No, because political capture means that you allow public money, in our case in Greece, right, to be used to promote private, personal political interests, and that is unacceptable. It is the public purse, and citizens have been contributing to it one way or another, not because we believe that you need to tax in order to have any program, but because we were under supervision, and that was that. There was no way out, right? So I think that the who runs it requires federal level, but the best practice I have seen comes from India. So let's really learn from each other, where you had a cadre of students and professors from universities acting as the supervisors, the overseers, that there was no corruption involved. And that was done at the local level. So that was mobilization, grassroots participation, because there was the Right to Information Act that backed it. It was not simply spontaneous reaction of students that wanted to safeguard the efficacy of the program, of the NREGA program that I talked about a little bit earlier. So you need both the law to support it, but in order for you to have the law, somebody has to advocate for it. Somebody has to prepare it, write it, and advocate for it, and pass it. So that's what I wanted to say for the who runs it. Who pays for it? In each country, in each case, it's going to be different. So I'm not going to get into this discussion. Short of MMT, you're going to have difficulties raising and allocating through the budget on an annual basis. You need to have the funds somehow, right? And you need to have it approved by Congress. So in each country, it will differ. I don't have much to say. You will see on one of my slides, I hope that they will be put on our website, yeah? No, I'm not going to use it. You will see that for Europe, at the stage that when we were preparing the study, we had suggested 5 alternatives, and specifically for Greece, what would work in order to get the funding in place. Pay and benefits, one of the first things that I did, Pavlina, was to pass a law where the conditions of employment had to be identical to those that prevailed in the formal market. Okay, not better. We could not do better given the circumstances, but at least identical. Types of work. Now, both the types of work and the who is eligible to participate really depend on the goals that you have in mind. And I don't know that the goal should be determined singularly by the Minister of Labor. There should be massive consultations on this, right? But there are some interesting things to notice. Physical and social infrastructure. So expanding early childhood development, for example, or home-based care, and are you replacing public jobs? No, you're not, because right now you do not have enough people to do them. So what you're doing effectively is you're hiring in from among the unemployed, you're providing the training 1 day a week, and you have on-the-job training being assistance to those that the program hires on a regular basis. So no, you're not replacing anybody. You are preparing another type of cadre of workers that actually should become part of the permanently employed in order to deliver the level of services that is required for the population. Now, it's all nice and good what I just said. And I advocated like crazy on that for South Africa and for India. But the best example that I have seen was through procurement contracts where women participated in small infrastructure improvements, ending up setting up their own small size, cooperative or not, enterprises, and through the procurement, the changes in the procurement law, once they exited the program and they had the skills, 20% of procurement would have to be allocated to cooperatives run by women that had gone through this programming, okay? So this way you are fighting not only you are addressing the general issues of unemployment and so on through a job guarantee, but you have the space to transform a division of labor that places women as carers and men exclusively as truck drivers, and they are doing the hardcore type of jobs, right? But this is to be decided by consultations. What you prioritize in order to deliver on the goals that society needs at the local level, but also at a more federal level. How to ensure inclusivity? Not very clear on how to answer this, except in our case, we had to come up with criteria as to who will be included. So if it is of any consolation, 30% of the people that participated had some form of disability. And if you look at the biggest sort of, in quotation marks, supporters of the program were the communities of disabled people and their representatives, because they would have never had a chance of getting hired in a market where you have 25% unemployment and gaining those skills. What are benefits to individuals and community? These have been addressed already. I would not belabor the point. And as to the political barriers and how to push through Congress, again, in each country, you will have your own specificities, but as I said earlier, grassroots mobilization and coalitions of the nature that you guys are forming and are trying to push through are extremely important. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not really going to spend too much time answering these questions, maybe by way of discussion. There are, on the question of who runs it and how projects are chosen, there seems to be a little bit of tension between sort of a federal oversight, federally managed or run program, and this aspiration that we need to have this design from the ground up, that people need to participate in some of the project design, project creation. And so I want to hear how you think about it legislatively. You know, we've seen how this is done, let's say in India, as the example. This is a federally funded program. The government is responsible for providing the budget and the funding. The job creation has to happen on the ground. And it's done in this very participatory way through these village councils called the Gram Panchayats, which is a very interesting model of design, of participatory design. And something I didn't mention in my presentation, but the India program is not contingent on you being unemployed. It is a guarantee. You can get rural employment, even whether you're working or not. It is guaranteed 100 days of work. And so you also participate in the village councils where people, get together and they say, look, we need this well, we need to, fix the road. That they participate in the design. And this is something that we saw also in Argentina. It was, designed from the bottom up, but it was done through this kind of bottom up proposal where people will petition the government for funding. They will go through some sort of approval process. In the case of India, so long as you fit within the broad parameters of the government, the government can't really say no to the project. Like they can't, they can deny the project only if it does not meet the criteria, the broad criteria of its agriculture or its environmental work, or if you want to do some private work, even though even private wells are allowed. But in some sense, there is this kind of, interesting accountability. So when we talk about design, how do you think about this, localized approach where we enhance support cooperatives, nonprofits, if you will, and this tension that you have identified that in some of these institutions are co-opted, right? That some of them are, fill their funds, and we may have some sort of design that doesn't serve the public purpose. How do you think about this as policy level?
Yeah.
I would distinguish very clearly between project selection, design, implementation, and as a follow-up, monitoring and evaluation. So what I said earlier about students in India, they were monitoring. And is this the best or the only monitoring process? No, there are different ways. But keeping in mind that you have these stages, when it comes to the choice, my suggestion anyway is that there are some broad categories. For example, environmental interventions, right? Now, who is going to choose and what is the process? Well, in our case in Greece, you could not have like a panchayat, you couldn't have like a village meeting. But what you do have is the council meetings of the municipal authorities. And the way the electoral process goes in Greece, you have representatives of all parties. And okay, so there is a committee of 15 people, and you have the school auditorium. And there is a discussion, and there is fighting, and eventually you come up with a list that has been approved by the council, but the council is elected by the people that are sitting in the auditorium. So I would see literally people walking up and saying, but don't you understand that when the kids go to school and they don't have safe pavements and they have to walk in the middle of the road, we have accidents. So why won't you include it? So this is the democratic process. This is, all I'm saying is that there has to be interaction at the local level once the broad strokes of what will be included is already determined. For project selection. Now, the design requires technical skills. And in many instances, the capacity within the municipality does not exist. In many cases, it does exist, but in smaller municipalities, it did not exist. So somebody had to do the work, right? In order to produce what they do in India as well, which is have shelf-ready projects. And that includes technical details of implementation. So that if you have a project, if you're ready for a project to begin, you must know how many people, how many hours, where do you begin, and what materials you're going to bring in, and so on and so forth. So you have to organize it. These are the technical files that you have to prepare. In Greece, again, luckily, most municipalities had technical personnel that would prepare those files. And in terms of the implementation, I want to say, again, from country to country, it will differ immensely. In Greece, NGOs, when my very good friend, Luca Cazzelli, decided to run the program overnight, NGOs sprang overnight. They had zero experience, okay, in implementing anything. They were just trying to get a piece of the pie, understandably so, one may say, but they could not run the project at all. So it was a disaster. There are other countries that have a very strong tradition where NGOs actually run much better than the state. And although I don't like the idea, that's what it is. So if you are to roll out a program tomorrow, you have to rely on those entities that can actually manage a project, a program. So again, it varies from country to country. Now, the social and solidarity economy, the social enterprises, is there space for unemployed people to participate and to learn something, to participate and eventually perhaps join? Yes, but I don't believe that social enterprises are in a position to execute a program. So what you're doing is you're biasing by providing funding. I'm talking about the case of Greece. I cannot generalize. You cannot bias their activities as by providing income to these entities to divert their attention from whatever their planning was to now become agents of implementation of a job guarantee. The way we did it was rather to seek opportunities from within the productive activity that the unemployed were engaged in to form, actually, if they so desired, social enterprises at the end of their working activity, the 8 months, 9 months, and there were several actually that were set up. So that's what I wanted to say. But you know, Pavlina, I remember Amita Sharma, who was the joint minister that was responsible for NREGA for many, many years in India, whom I had the pleasure to meet. And she told me, if you ever, as if I ever imagined that I would be actually implementing the program in Greece, she said, never wait until everything is perfectly in place. It will never be done. What you have to have is a methodology so that you can learn quickly, especially from those that are your harshest critics, and turn it around, okay? In all the details, in anything that needs to change. Be prepared, therefore, with a strong monitoring mechanism. And that we did, and I think we avoided many mistakes by having such a mechanism.
I'll try to be brief. I'll say I agree with pretty much everything. I'll say the design of policy and program will differ. You want definitely some insight from local communities as to what they need and some agency as to what they need. Implementation almost has to be local. But a key thing is you need federal oversight of the implementation of this. You need federal oversight of the management of this. Yeah. And we can look at American history for some examples. We can look at the Faustian bargain where Southern legislators negotiated for the capacity to administer USDA funds in a local way, and they legislated the laws in ways that did not allow for federal oversight. That was intentional. The GI Bill being able to be administered in local ways in a Jim Crow context without federal oversight was intentional. If we contrast it with programs, I think the WPA had some federal oversight. The CCC, these were not perfect, but they had some federal oversight. But the point is, as was mentioned, you don't want local capture for a host of reasons, be it racism, sexism, or just cronyism. You want to have some adjudication to be able to have some oversight. The last thing I just want to say is another source of tension I suspect we're going to go to is the role of nonprofits. I think it's probably going to vary across country, but I'll reserve my comments if we go there, but I think we might have some tension as to whether we think nonprofits should be a viable way by which the federal job guarantee can be implemented.
Sorry, thanks. Okay, good. Yeah. First of all, another name building on Helen is Trudy Goldberg, who's the chair of the National Jobs for All Network, and should have mentioned earlier. Also, it's an absolute pleasure to be on a panel with you, Rania. We had to Columbia back when I was still a student there, and then shortly, I think before or after, I forget, Syriza came, and it was Columbia and then Brookings were the two places you went to, and as our student group that organized one, and that was when you were still opposition, and then you won and actually had a chance to do the thing. And it was watching that fight in 2015 was one of the most brave parliamentary actions I've ever seen. So when you say you're done thinking leadership comes to the top, it's because you really did a David and Goliath job. And to say that the progressives there were not always on your side, I mean, I know that there was a lot of criticism that was lent to NMT as part of that Syriza coalition, but I was close enough, very from a distance, but close enough to see how many other forces there were within that coalition that you also had to negotiate with before there was even something that came out. So it's just, watching that moment get kneecapped in 2015 and then you stay and keep doing the work has been pretty inspirational. So I completely agree about working not only in Parliament or in legislation. I mean, the people I work with in Congress are the ones who are working with social movements. They're the movement representative there, but they are not a politician first. They're not a party member first. Their loyalty is outside to those grassroots movements. And in the interest of trying to not resolve tension, but maybe recast it in a constructive way, and maybe it's wrong, so let me know, but John Haskell kind of was inspiring my approach to this panel after yesterday, frankly. But I'm maybe thinking about this difference in terms of the wage or the momentum, idea versus details, as a question of momentum versus specificity, as a question of trying to go for the big thing and also having steps along the way. And that those are you need a momentum, but you also need a theory of when you have breaks in that momentum that you turn the page. You say, this is a chapter. This is a campaign. We go out and we fight this fight, and then we come back and reassess. And they need to have specific win goals. They need to have specific criteria that will always be limited relative to the big goal, but are important as markers that you can assess whether you won or lost that campaign, what you did to reflect, to take that break. It's a metaphor, but they say, I read somewhere once, and botanists can please call me out, but a lot of plants who grow by photosynthesis need the nighttime to actually do the growing, and then they recharge with the photosynthesis. So I like to think of it that way. So in one sense, I think of Darrick, you're going for the big win, right? You're thinking of victory at the end it is public. Why do we need 25 different, parts of this when it can be federal in a sense? And when it comes to being specific, those specific details are always going to be a compromise or betrayal of the big vision. And there is a tension there. And in a sense, you're building the power and building the momentum. And then I'm thinking like a Weasley lawyer who goes in and negotiates on behalf of the strikes and makes a bunch of concessions that make people unpleasant, and then going back outside and helping you win. So I don't know if maybe that's a way to think of it less of a tension and more of a steps that, yeah.
Just for clarity, I'm talking about the implementation of a federal job guarantee. Yeah. I'm not opposed to local initiatives that promote job guarantees, but the federal job guarantee is what the tension is. And once that's implemented, that is the gold star.
Yeah. And then I think, for example, to give a concrete example that I was thinking about this, with the regional wage variation, right? If you have a high enough regional wage variation, everybody in West Virginia is better off, and then it has that geographic redistribution. But if we're not going to get that politically and we get a lower wage with a positive regional variation, then that's going to have more justice than a lower wage without that, in a sense. Maybe it comes at a dialectic cost to the push for the higher one, but that's maybe just to recast it as you're thinking, hey, we can get this wage, we can bring everything up, and the others are thinking, if we can't, we can push up the ones that need it the most. And that might just be a straight up good faith tactical disagreement about priorities, but I'm not sure if that actually puts them in tension. I don't know.
Well, I didn't know we were debating that, but I guess I'm not opposed to regions being able to top off the wages that the federal government offers. Yeah. The federal government shouldn't be in the business of defining different regions for the nation as it relates to the program. But if New York said, we also want to add additional wages to our program, I'm not opposed to that, so that's not.
And I think this is the common ground, that the kind of conversations, because the next question to me would be, what about the state? Where do they get the money? If they're in a different position with the money question, then maybe they actually should and want to do that, but they're literally fiscally constrained. And if we have a separate federal program to provide that support, then it can be a state level issue, but we've addressed the MMT kind of funding question. Anyway, one other quick thought on this is just on I loved you describing it as selection, design, implementation, monitoring, evaluation. That idea of unbundling is one of the things that we try to teach at law school about the state, right? When I said, is money a creature of the state or creature of the law, right? There is no one thing called the state. There's a judiciary, which as we know right now is on its whole own thing in the United States. There's the legislature, which you pass stuff and then you hand it out to whom? The president. If it's Trump, that makes a big difference, right? If they send someone to the SEC and says, we're not going to enforce anything, then maybe you didn't want to design something that assumed the SEC was the best place to do it, even if logically it might be. Maybe you need to think about the internal institutional arrangements, both horizontally within a level of government as well as federally. Because I love federal standards, don't get me wrong, but federal education standards are constitutionally prohibited right now, which is why President Obama in 2010 managed to break that logjam for the first time in 30 years by doing the Race to the Top initiative. And they imposed terrible standards, in my opinion, but the way they did it was to say to all the state governors, you get together and come up with a set of standards you agree on, and I'll give you a big pot of money if you can all play nice. And that was the only legal tactic that got around the constitutional prohibition. And, I don't think it's perfect, but that's the kind of stuff that when we get that granular, we have to be thinking about. And the same with the nonprofit is that in one sense, a nonprofit is just a public agency that's had extremely attenuated governance structure. And there is a public good requirement in the definition of a nonprofit in the United States that is extremely underdefined and extremely underregulated. So don't get me wrong, I'm not at all advocating the status quo approach to that, but once we start getting to universities as administrators of federal standards and cooperatives and things like that, I think we have to actually look at capacity there. Anyway, sorry.
All right, so really quick, I guess Rohan gets a few pop shots in, so I guess a couple of things. One, federal standards to me add some air of democracy, as opposed to some of the local control by which you can have a tyranny of masses that aren't going to enforce rights. So the issue with nonprofits. Let me be clear with what it is that I have a problem with nonprofits. What is the role of nonprofits in America, and what should it be? Let's start with that question. We have an industrial nonprofit complex where we subsidize the whims and desires of some wealthy people and some structures, sometimes to our good, but not always to our good, and it's almost antithetical to democracy. I believe nonprofits have a role in our society. I think they can, if you like art, support arts. If you want to provide demonstrations because you want to show pathways that political infrastructures are limited in doing, like take a chance that's outside of politics, I support that work as well. But I have a fear of abdicating government responsibility to nonprofits, and currently it's being done. When nonprofits start doing the work of government, that's not the way we should be going. It leaves us at the whim of charity that changes, however well-meaning some philanthropists may be at time X. And there's also other problems. There's political co-optation that can take place if we use federal job guarantees through nonprofits. Indeed, some people argued that the Black Power movement, which went from political organizations to community organizations, was intentionally co-opted by people like the Nixon administration, who offered resources in a way that did so in exchange for certain behaviors and conditions, and were able to choose winners and losers. So I have a fear of all this type of government resources going in ways that would be anti-democratic and potentially exponentially enhancing private power that could be problematic.
Okay, I'm going to open it to questions, but I want to pitch in here that I definitely think these are really hard, very important questions. They're very context specific, so I just want to give you a little sense of how it's done in some other places. You know, in Argentina, it was a federal program, federally funded. They were federal projects. They were big infrastructure federal projects. The projects that we got to see were the ones that were created from the ground up by the communities, by the unemployed themselves, and there's a pre-existing institutional infrastructure that permitted that. There are small political organizations, community groups, they're very active, they're organizing on the ground, they were banging the pots and pans on the streets asking for jobs. So in some sense, like, you have some sort of organizational capacity that can deliver that. And they lobbied the government and they said, look, if you're going to have this program, you're going to have a representative. We want to be sitting in the Ministry of Labor. We want to be communicating those ideas. So they created a position. And so it was very interesting to see this kind of model of design, but also how community threw resources together to make sure the jobs happened. You know, people donated garages, they built structures, they made it happen. Like, if the job were there, you know, and they had plenty of actually other institutional capacity that can be used for sites of work. But what ended up happening is that it was the federal government that actually tossed the program out under some very insidious kind of views of who's employable and who's unemployable. And you know, it pains me to say that it was Christina Kirchner, that it was her government that basically argued women are unemployable. This program artificially brings them into the labor market, send them home to take care of their children, give them a basic income grant. And they wouldn't go. There were pilot programs that were run by the World Bank. And as long as the projects were still running, the jobs guarantee, the HEFES projects were still running, people went to work. They might collect actually the slightly higher basic income grant check, but they would show up. And so it's very interesting how the program was kind of phased out and then closed out by the federal government. On the other hand, you go to Brussels, which has this program called Actiris, which is a small program. It's a guarantee, youth guarantee program. I mean, they have phenomenal infrastructure. They have this big government building in Brussels and multi-level, multi-floors. They have caseworkers, they have training, they have education, they have outreach for, migrant workers, for people who are suffering domestic abuse. I mean, it was multi-layered, so well organized by the public sector, right? And, they would reach out to various sites, but to create the jobs and opportunities, but it was definitely a government-run program. France, as I said, it actually is based on enterprises. They do create these, social enterprises which provide the site of work and the training. So very much a kind of a different model in different corners of the world. And, for us, we have some really serious issues with the corporatization of the nonprofit sector, kind of the siphoning off of federal funds. And at the same time, right here, we've got groups that are already cleaning the river. They're doing the kind of community support work, that solidarity kind of work that happens on volunteer basis. And it should not be done on volunteer basis. It is not a good way of providing a safety net. And, those capacities on the ground could be mobilized through the Job Guarantee Program. I'm going to shut up and then open it for questions. So we're going to get a bunch, and so in the back.
My first question is for Rania. I got really curious. Oh, sorry. Can you pass that back? Thank you. My first question is for Rania. I suppose it's slightly technical, and I got really curious. Oh, okay, sure. Okay, I'll do my outside voice. All right. So my question is perhaps a little technical. I'm very curious about the percentage of people who participated who relocated. That might not be a problem for Greece. I'm imagining this in the United States, and then I'm imagining the effect of people relocating from unemployment in Nebraska and going all the way over to Florida, and then the housing market being affected by the inevitable inflation that's going to be caused if there's no increase in the housing stock if people relocate. Not everyone will relocate, but America is a country of relocators. I mean, people move.
So I'm interested to know what you all think the role. Oh, I can speak up louder, just a little bit. I'm interested to know what you all think the role that borders plays in the implementation of a job guarantee. Because if you're thinking about, especially with someone like P.O. Hanson's book, A Modern Migration Theory, the idea that anyone can get a job anywhere, where does that sort of lead when nations and mixed families have to sort of cross each other and encounter each other? And then secondly, specifically on the institutional aspect, like if you're considering like all the work that we're doing, I think I heard for the first time this whole week the filibuster mention. You know, like I think it's very important that if you're considering, like in America's context specifically, we have 6 times as many institutional backlogs to make it hard to just pass a law. And so it feels like I feel like the fear of like any nonprofit institution, or in my mind, any institution that's not the libraries, is rife with some type of like corruption already in the world that we exist today. So shouldn't we also focus from the American context on PAYGO, the filibuster, gerrymandering, just to, you know, make Republicans compete for more than 30% of the pie alone and Democrats not 70? Like that alone, if we want to do anything, seems like a bigger priority, but I'm more interested in the borders aspect too.
Let's take one more question. Two more? Okay, yeah, let's go on this side, please. You have a couple of big questions right there.
Hi, thanks so much for your remarks. I have a question about eligibility. My primary interest is in the anti-carceral implications of the federal jobs guarantee. Because in my estimation, the federal jobs guarantee would represent sort of precisely an antithetical institutional formation to mass incarceration, which functions as our program for unemployment and poverty in the United States. So I would be curious to hear you reflect on that, but also with regards to eligibility specifically. Since many of the people towards whom a jobs program would be directed have been affected by American criminal justice systems, and you know my question is about the U.S. right now, and have conviction histories, you know, criminal records, previous time spent in prison, and a lot of the work that we're imagining taking place under the jobs guarantee seems to fall under the category of like the care economy, or like care workers, supportive positions in schools, elder care, etc. Those are the types of jobs from which many formerly incarcerated people are barred, right? So I'm curious what measures might be taken to avoid a situation in which the jobs guarantee fails to meet the needs of the exact populations to whom it's directed.
One more question, and we can. Yeah, go ahead, please.
My question is probably less interesting than the rest of them. It's sort of about accounting gimmicks and maybe other rhetorical devices, and like to what extent they're useful. For example, like treasury financing, like sort of treasury dollars financing the job guarantee, as opposed to having it be part of the normal sort of deficit or primary deficit, and whether there's any room for that, or if it just adds confusion and is not helpful, or other rhetorical kind of gimmicks or anything.
Oh, okay. Borders. Well, at the end of the day, if it's a human right, the ultimate goal is for it to extend borders. But the practical reality in the interim is that that probably wouldn't happen. However, I did reference a Marshall Plan. So using a federal job guarantee type infrastructure in a non-exploitive way is not necessarily a bad thing either. What else? Filibuster, I'm with you, that this strategy has to be broadened in specifically to federal job guarantee. We need to build power and be strategic and coordinated across programs. This can't be a one-issue thing, otherwise we're destined for failure and won't achieve our goals. Some people can have specialty and expertise, but we need to be coordinated in the management and acquisition of power. The anti-carceral state, I love the question you raised. Indeed, a federal job guarantee should be useful in reducing some of the ecology conditions that lead to incarceration. Better resourced people will be less vulnerable to a lot of times predation that leads them to be incarcerated. So there's that aspect. And then who's eligible? Well, if you're incarcerated and you're not incarcerated, you still are a citizen. So as by definition of right, you should have a right to a job, but I know I'm not answering your question directly, so I will. I was trying to be cute. But to answer your question directly, there will be certain, if you're somebody, and we've been in a network where people have gaslit us and made the case of saying stuff literally, I don't want somebody formerly incarcerated to take care of my kids. So not only is that racist, because it was racist, whether they realized it or not. It's gaslighting. For one, that person is elite enough where they would have private child care anyway, so they weren't even making an argument. But in reality, if somebody is incarcerated for something that has to do with malfeasance of children, you're not entitled to a specific job. There are other jobs that you would be able to do. But if you were incarcerated for drug use, you shouldn't be excluded from getting training so that you can deliver high quality child care. So the act of incarceration in and of itself might limit, depending on what the crime was, certain types of jobs, but it doesn't limit you from jobs. And it's racist to think that formerly incarcerated people can't do certain types of jobs. I think that's it. Oh, the last thing, money. Money's fungible. So to me, it becomes political when we talk about how it's funding, where the funding stream is. But in my framework, a dollar in the federal government is a dollar in the federal government. But because it would be implemented as a right, the federal government would have the legal responsibility to provide the finances to ensure that the federal job guarantee was implemented.
Let me start with the last question about financing. I think the idea of bond treasuries financing is fantastic. We proposed it actually at the European level, that there should be a special fund that is supported by ESM, ECB, and ECB. Why not? Fantastic. Couple that with the fact that it should not enter at all the primary deficit calculation. It should be excluded as spending because it is an investment that should stay outside the Maastricht agreement. Now, what I'm telling you is a proposal that has the signature of the 9 ministers of labor. It was initiated by Greece, and the 9 countries that are implementing some form of a job guarantee signed on it. And why did we do that? Because we wanted it to go to the spring semester, which is very important within the European context, the European Parliament, and then send it to Mr. Juncker that had actually initiated the Youth Guarantee Program. It just stopped at the 9 signatures, and it did not go anywhere else. But I think as an idea, it is excellent. Relocation. The way the program was designed in Greece gave the option of participating in 2 localities, one where you were registered as a resident, and the second one in an adjacent one, so that we would not have the problem of relocation. It would have been impossible at the minimum wage that prevailed and the program paid to pay for housing, let alone that in Greece, traditionally, there is no mobility. Okay, you stay within your area. The eligibility and mass incarceration, again, from the Greek experience, there was nothing excluding you. In other words, it is part of our legal system that there is no, unless you have committed murder or child molestation, these are the 2, nobody exactly knows that you were incarcerated. I mean, you enter the labor market like everybody else. But what you said gave me an idea, because there is this issue of the job guarantee, but when it comes to specific interventions, coming out of prison, you know that this college has a program, the BARD initiative in prisons, where people get their degrees, undergraduate degrees, and faculty go from here to the prison. They teach on a regular basis, and the exams are regular exams, and they graduate, and so on and so forth. Now, it's a wonderful idea, actually, that should be taken up, not as a jobs guarantee. I mean, you can call it a job guarantee, but that there should be a first-time work experience after you come out of prison, right? And that this should be guaranteed at the federal level, so that you can be integrated in the labor market. It does not mean that because you were in prison that you are in need of a job guarantee. You may have the skills and the opportunities may be out there for you to get a job in the labor market, but there is this built-in bias that becomes even bigger if you don't have that first-time experience, job experience. So that would be something to consider, actually, within the framework of the job guarantee for specific categories for reintegration of specific populations. Okay, I'll stop here.
So in the interest of taking, community health seriously, when Darrick said I took pod shots, I did something wrong. I didn't mean to, but I did. And he said, you stated my position. And he's right. So let me try and explain what I was trying to get at and explain my position better. My talk yesterday was an attempt to say the state government, we should be critical of the state even as we affirm its value in this system. We should acknowledge that people have negative experiences of the state and it can be a force for totalitarian authoritarianism as well as positive social good. And I think I'm on the other side maybe now, thinking in terms of non-profits. I want to rehabilitate that institutional structure. I want to acknowledge that there is a non-profit industrial complex and that there's a tendency to push things to places where you can easily defeat the public accountability process. And I think those are things we should 100% and hopefully can all agree on. I think the other part, though, for me, what I'm trying to do is take conflicts of interest seriously. So I'll tell you one example that matters a lot to me. I was representing kids in family court in New York State, and there were 2 ways to do that, apart from being a private practitioner and doing some pro bono work. One was representing children in the Administration for Children's Services as a government employee. The other was representing in a non-profit law firm like the Children's Law Center or Lawyers for Children or Advocates for Children, all of which I've had experience with. And the reason those 2 exist was because once upon a time there was only the Administration of Children's Services, and they had responsibilities to look after the kids, but they also had responsibilities to look after the public interest more broadly. And there were times that those conflicted. And particularly the thing that got lost in the mix was a direct voice for individuals in the manner that we have set up the legal system so that lawyers are both officers of the court but also direct advocates for individuals. And that's a messy dance down to the level of individual life decisions that we have not got a clear dividing line on. But we create lawyers as an independent class of court officers with a distance institutionally from the rest of the system, and in the European and other parliamentary systems, it's formalized between barristers and solicitors precisely in recognition that there are conflicts of interest. So what I'm trying to think of is all public, but is there a role for non-profit institutions when we get that granular at federal, state, different bureaucratic institutions to think about where non-profits could fit in there, not because they're charities that could come and go, but because having an institutional separation between a public agency acting as government, public agency acting as individual qua individual is going to need some formal operational separation. And right now, the legal entity looks like a non-profit. But I would sign any dotted line in the interest of community building and coalition building that says that the non-profit industrial complex needs to be out of this entirely. And then what we're talking about is intra-public, even if that's civil in a sense. So that gets me to prison abolition. So first of all, I think the 13th Amendment is a site for serious political struggle, and it's another great place to connect with legal advocates, because the reason that you can do that slave labor in the prison system right now is because the 13th Amendment especially carves out an exception for slave labor. Once you can't do that, then we have to start taking seriously the idea of jobs within prisons and a job guarantee there. And that's an actually interesting site for looking at what work could be done and pushing the boundary of that question of how you did something bad, what social responsibilities do you deserve to have taken away? In disability world, my father's dealt with federal government employees that get injured, and the test is the least restrictive means. So we can think about ways of adopting that kind of model if there are sort of asocial, antisocial concerns we need to deal with. What's the least restrictive means of still keeping them connected to the rest of the community? And being able to start that conversation in prisons, because we've gotten rid of the 13th Amendment thing, I think is a big part of it. The other part, to your point, and actually I want to have a shout out to a colleague of mine, Kelly Orion. She's a law professor at the University of Virginia. I met her when I was a children's attorney. She has an organization called the First 72 Hours, and they meet you at the door of prison. They take you and they put you in a job building houses for other formerly incarcerated people. And she turned that into a massive clinic in Louisiana after fighting a constitutional case to get the death penalty for people under 18 abolished. And that's the next thing that she did. And she comes to me and says, hey, how do I build this? And I say, look, I'm trying to get you unlimited pots of federal money. I'll let you know when I've made some progress. But she's the kind of person who spent a huge amount of time thinking about that issue, and I'd name her first. And then this goes into, I think, one of the things in your talk is credentialism is such an important form of legal standardized building to get away from the corruption of individuals. If we say, if you have this credential, you deserve this right to this job, or we're going to recognize your capacity, and then the credential is available through universal education, and we provide that through something like criminal justice reentry education networks. And again, shout out to the New York Criminal Justice Reentry Education Network. I think we're starting to put some pieces together in a way we can see a pathway to using work and access that's helpful. Lastly, on the borders immigration point, anyone can get a job anywhere. Yep, that's the goal. I think at the theoretical level, people are a value, not a cost. And if we can get that flipped, that's the fundamental one that starts us away from the fascist austerity mindset that leads to closed borders. I think the other thing to think about here on the other side of pathways to citizenship and that kind of stuff is simply just less surveillance. I would not support a job guarantee that came with a chip in everybody's neck, and I hope no one else would here either. But you don't need a chip in everyone's neck, right? You just bioprint them and I print them, and then monitor all their computers that they use at work and all their email accounts, and then you spy on them at home anyway, right? So what we need to think about maybe is what it would look like a little bit, maybe more like someone just turning up at the place with the truck and saying, hey, jump on the back for the day. And you can go do that, no questions asked. Now, maybe there are jobs that you wouldn't trust those people with versus others, right? But having that as part of the job guarantee. I push for anonymous digital cash as part of a monetary infrastructure. We can push for an anonymous, no questions asked, here's a hand crank to turn money comes out kind of anonymous job guarantee. And that could be a way to say you can earn money even before the rest of the administrative state is ready to recognize your humanity. Lastly, accounting gimmicks. I think the MMT fight for full employment, this is the symbol. Treasury dollars financing the job guarantee was a way to say we're not going to have this turned back 3 months later with an austerity commission and a national debt. So it's just the MMT intervention in that moment coming through with those gimmicks, I think. Thank you.
I mean, people who don't live in this country, just if you pay attention to prison labor, people who don't live in this country, who don't pay attention to prison labor, I mean, they probably would be shocked. California gets incinerated every summer, fires, prison labor fights the fires. They don't get paid. and then they walk out of prison, they can't get a job in the firefighting department. I mean, it's just absolutely absurd. So there is an important, I mean, all of the things that Rohan said, 13th Amendment, paying decent wages while you're fighting the fires, why do we rob you from that aspect of your humanity too? But banning the box is an important movement, right? Because in Greece, that might not be an issue. You come out of prison and you are part of the labor force, but here you have a mark, it's a scarlet letter, right? You have a prison letter, a prison record, and you have to check the box. And so when you submit an application, that's a very important movement. But if there's no job to apply to, then that, in and of itself is not super effective. But we also exempt disabled people from getting good wages, right? Federal law allows us to pay people with disabilities as low as $1 an hour. It's absolutely egregious, extraordinary. So the job guarantee, again, is not going to be able to, address these legal issues, but it will provide an opt-out. It will provide a decent, dignified job. On accounting gimmicks, I mean, you make this argument very well. What is an accounting gimmick? Virtually everything is an accounting gimmick. Like the treasury account at the Fed, the general account, the accounts at the, private banks, the treasury. When you look at, Europe, which has robbed itself of monetary sovereignty, but happened to rediscover it in the midst of a crisis, it happened through accounting gimmicks. They call them instruments, right? They don't call them gimmicks, but you've got this funding instrument and that funding instrument. And it's just, the central bank is finding some sort of mechanism to fund these programs. They have the SURE, which is the support to mitigate unemployment risk in an emergency. That was the SURE instrument that we've been arguing as we're proposing a European job guarantee, that you could use that as a funding mechanism. There is the public sector purchase programs where you're providing backstop to public government securities for governments that are responding to the pandemic. I mean, these are gimmicks broadly defined, but also I think this is correct, that there was the Constitutional Court recently found that the PCPP, this public sector purchase program, actually did not circumvent Article 132 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. And that article says that you can't monetize the debt. But actually, it is a monetization of debt. But they argue that it doesn't violate that rule. So you see, I think you can come up with all sorts of arrangements to fund this stuff. Okay. Let's take another round. Yes.
Thank you. So what do, it seems like a big, it sounds like one problem, or it seems like a big problem for JG proposals worldwide is a limited imagination, to not understanding what the alternative could be, not wanting to invest time to explore that. So if that is true, and people in general and the key people might be blinded to the potential of doing all this unprofitable work that might not have a place in private industry. What do you call that? What do you call clearing out all this old debt of the backlog of neglected work, or actually good environmental stewardship, or caring for our communities, for ourselves? What do you call that backlog?
What do you mean?
So we have a clear term for national debt, as in, that seems like something that needs to be paid off. We have immense amounts of work that is undone and neglected, and so I'm wondering, is there a term for this, or what can we talk about to say, hey, this needs to be done?
Okay, well,
sorry, we'll take it.
A few questions on that side. Go ahead.
Hi. I love following MMT and being part of all this, but I'm clearly part of the business community. I'm not public sector, I'm not education. And I loved Rohan and John's talk yesterday about finding, non-traditional cooperative relationships. So the question is, tensions aside, have you considered working more cooperatively, at least, or in consult with the business community, especially the small business community, in advancing some of the JG type initiatives?
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you. A little bit following this comment, My question is whether that exists already, or how we can embed like an analysis of power. And coming back to Darrick, power of the people is important, but like existing power outside of state power, like the business power, the power of multinational corporations, the power of the super wealthy. I feel like the discussions always go to, we understand the treasury finances perfectly, but then there's the question of power, and the politicians are all bought and we can't move forward, but it kind of comes as an afterthought. We first talk about economics, everything's possible, and then, oh, there's the big challenge that comes. So how can we, in an MMT kind of theory, embed a theory of power of multinational corporations, of these class interests, in the analysis itself? Like, as we have these nice diagrams about the treasury and the Fed and how everything works, have diagrams, how does Amazon come in, how does JP Morgan come in? And through that, learn maybe also other forms of cooperation with maybe parts of the business community that are maybe could be in solidarity with this movement, or not, or where can we move against this power outside of the purely legislative apparatus? Thank you.
To diversify. Okay. Sounds good. Could you pass this back to your right? Thank you.
Thank you. So my question is, what do you think about the relationship between the job guarantee and the digitalization or AI or automation thing? I mean, like currently, like many people really investing in those areas really like passionately, even in like essential areas like the healthcare or education. But the kind of the assumption with the job guarantee program is really like creating enough good jobs. So when this kind of the technological, development might reduce the total amount of the jobs, how do you balance this kind of technological development and the jobs enough to be like offer people?
Be very fast. Technology is the villain when you can't have full employment. We don't want technology to be the villain. I mean, technology can be the villain in this dystopian future of like surveillance and all of that. So it absolutely is, there's that path to our future. But there's a different path. We shouldn't be working 9 to 5 days a week. We should be working 3 days a week, right? And that, we're talking about the good life, not that everybody should be busy doing something. And so I think technology can be deployed for the well-being, and I would call it maybe well-being debt. I don't have a term for what Andy's asking, but it's really good to think about. Like there is debt to be repaid. All of the public investment that we did not undertake and the neglect that came with it, that's kind of a debt to humanity. So let's find a good word for it. And on the business community, I will say that there hasn't been like a meeting with the Small Business Bureau or with the Chamber of Commerce. We find different allies depending on where they're at. Some folks this resonates with them, but we are now working actually with the bigger coalition. The Job Guarantee is connected to a broader democratizing work movement where we're talking about how we democratize the workplace. Like how does the firm is organized in ways where workers can have a lot more input in the government of the firm, and we have found some receptive, interested people in those conversations. But I think perhaps more. Put us in touch.
After you.
Okay.
I'm used to your technique. No.
So, okay, first of all, on the limited imagination thing, I think, one of my law professors used to say law school's an imagination test. You can say anything is, but being a musician in many respects felt like an imagination test to me, because many imaginative people make great, good music just by picking up a guitar. But if you have, the ability to play more than 3 chords, you might have a wider palette to make interesting stuff with. I was trained as a classical musician, had a pretty wide palette and nothing to say. But when I got to law school, I found I had some stuff to say, and that's the imagination test that I use. But I think we're all trying to think about how to vision this stuff out, and it's partially about the art of communicating, right? If you're a good musician, you feel pain, you can express that in a rich palette that can say things that words can't. Or if you're a poet, you can say things with words that you might not be able to otherwise. So I think part of it is thinking about the art side of this whole thing, the art of communicating, the art of all of this, and what it means to bridge the gap between what rationality might get to and what something else might get to. And we can envisage bigger, beautiful worlds through art that we can't through logic. The Green New Deal video that was drawn out with Molly Crabapple, I think, helped a lot of people see something different. And that's because the artists were involved in the movement as well as just the intellectuals. In terms of sort of framing language, the national debt, we could call it austerity debt, or we could have a group that works on framing and thinks about that and thinks about the techniques really seriously. And I think that's what you're really getting at. So yes, I think Stephanie showed us that memes and framing are so important, brought that tradition in. Randy's written a meme for money. We've talked about framing. Fadel wrote a poem, thinking about the language construction down to the choice of vocabulary. That's one of the reasons the mint the coin worked for me. I wrote a whole paper about how the coin was a symbol that kids could understand. Much better democratic symbol for money than a central bank account. And then when you go digital, or you say it's $1 trillion coin, it breaks the link between real value, because everyone knows a piece of metal this big, even the coolest metal in the world's not worth $1 trillion. So it's taking the real and the nominal and breaking your brain a little bit. So it was a great symbol. I loved it. It was a perfect symbol attack. In the business interests, I work a lot with free and open source software and hardware. I think there's really interesting bleeding edge stuff there. I think we're doing stuff now with eCash where if you don't have the technical thing to show it's real, we can't do anything. So working with people who are building good stuff and helping that. But another way to think about that is to try to have a justice win in there. So when you fund something with public money, maybe you can make it open source licensed, and then you're building a commons, right? If you fund something in an industry, maybe you want to put certain resources in a non-profit foundation commons-based model, and then put other resources with the for-profit businesses and allow them to compete and have a real conversation about when you want to allow that for-profit market competition within a larger commons industry. I don't think automation is going to kill jobs that matter. I like massages from humans. I like music written by my friends. I like jokes by people I think I could one day be as funny as. And people are getting paid to hug in countries where human connection's on the way down. So, and those are places that have a pretty advanced tech sector. So I think, when it comes to AI, it's obviously happening. But what it's going to look like, as we're seeing with these smart algorithms online, is if we're a sick community, we're going to have a sick AI. We're going to have a racist ass, totalitarian, bigoted guy, and it's going to be a guy, obviously. And we're trying to get to the state of society where we're deserving of a good AI. So, we need tech ethics to be part of this. And that includes on the way up there, what Pavlina's saying, and it includes when we're there, when we have full employment. What's the tech ethics of the worker experience, of the home experience, of the device you take into work in your pocket? Because that matters just as much as, everything else. Thanks.
We got two more. I got the mic. I can't hear you. Sorry. All right, so narrative work. I agree. Stephanie Kelton is spot on and wrote a real good book about it, talking about thinking about the public debt, and I hope I don't mischaracterize it, as a surplus for people. Right, that public debt is a surplus for everyone else. Some of the framing I try to use is, again, investment framing. Putting resources in people is not a deficit. Those are investments in America's most treasured resources. And I don't think that's just narrative. I really believe that. The role of business. Well, you have coalitions of the willing. You have coalitions of the good. And anybody, like any movement, want to take part and do good, great. And then the advice of what they can do, first and foremost, be good citizens. Be good to your workers. Be good to your customers. And then use the power of your resources to provide demonstrations to compel government. But at the end of the day, there is this inherent tension that we need to recognize. A federal job guarantee is in tension with profit the way we currently define it. That's just the reality. Workers will be better empowered to bargain for better wages, and there will be a shift in power, and that is by design. Currently, corporations have an exorbitant amount of power that, in my view, is unjust. So it doesn't do away with corporations. It's a rebalance of power that's more just, and those that are willing, great. Let me also add that this is related to the nonprofit conversation we've been having. So now I'm gonna get a couple of responses, which is, one, I think the example that Rohan gave was a legal conflict of interest that's irrespective of a federal job guarantee that needs to be redressed. The other issue, the quote of, "I'm trying to get unlimited pots of federal money in your hands." Well, that might be good for the person that he identified, but I will say it's not democratic, and you could imagine other figures that would be doing the same thing in a way that's detrimental to some of our progress. So that's my fear. My fear is that nonprofits shouldn't go away. Coalitions of the willing and good, and by the way, they get lots of money, lots of subsidies. The tax deductions that go to nonprofits are tremendous. So that's not democratic either. So I'm not arguing that they should go away, but the federal job guarantee as a program, that's what I'm arguing shouldn't be directed resources towards the nonprofit sector for the reasons I mentioned. Last thing, AI. Artificial intelligence fits within the rubric of technological change, and we've seen this before. And as Pavlina said, technological change can be good and bad. At issue is, are we going to allow the structures for that technological change to be exploitive and extractive? You know, I'm reminded of the cotton gin, which was extremely extractive. American productivity enhanced dramatically, but it was almost the epitome of exploitation. But we can make different choices. We can use the federal job guarantee as a mechanism to facilitate empowerment with this technological change, and jobs are not going to disappear. Some jobs will, but work itself won't disappear. New jobs will emerge that we can't even foresee. This story has happened in the past, and the signs already are not that AI is displacing work, but that work, maybe combined with AI, is becoming more exploited. But we can make different choices, and Pavlina has also made this point. What better way to have a mechanism to absorb buffer stocks of those that are displaced from technology than a federal job guarantee itself?
My colleagues have addressed all of your concerns, so I'll go for dinner. Thank you very much. Thanks.